As we just have 1 hour, and the minister has not yet joined, I suggest we get underway and we ask him to join when he arrives. So my name's Amar Bhattacharya. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. It's my pleasure to moderate this side event. Excellencies, GISD Alliance members, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending this side event of the Forum on Financing for Development and the SDG Investment Fair taking place today. This side event is on enhancing multilateral development banks as catalyzers of private finance. We will have the opportunity to discuss the recommendations put forward by the Alliance to strengthen the role of multilateral development banks as catalyzers of private finance in support of sustainable development. The GISD Alliance, as most of you know, is a group of 30 CEOs that was convened by the Secretary General of the United Nations to scale up and facilitate the alignment of private finance and investment with the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. We will talk further about this agenda, benefiting from, of course, the perspectives from the Alliance as well as perspectives from the MDB community. So this is a really great opportunity to bring both perspectives to bear. We will also hear perspectives from His Excellency Dr. Ahmed Kamali, Deputy Minister of Planning and Economic Development of Egypt, when he arrives. Let me just very briefly introduce the panel that will be participating in this, and then I'll explain how the structure of this works, and we will get underway right away. So in addition to Dr. Kamali, we have Marc-André Blanchard. He's no stranger to you in the UN. He's presently Executive Vice President and Head of CDPQ Global, which is Canada's largest pension fund. He was also co-lead of the GISD MDB task force. We also have Liz Bronder. She is Managing Director, Global Sustainable Finance at the Bank of America, also co-lead of the GISD MDB task force. We have Denise Odaro. She's the Head of Investor Relations and Sustainable Finance Coordination at the International Finance Corporation. And IFC, of course, is a leading player in the mobilization of private finance. We have Jorge Velarde, Director of Funds and Investments from CAF, also known as the Development Bank of Latin America. And finally, we have Marcus Svedberg, investment strategist, Fourth Swedish National Pension Fund, AP4. So we have a truly excellent panel. We will begin with Mr. Blanchard and Ms. Bronde laying out the findings and recommendations of the MDB task force. They have put it forward in a report, and they will base their presentation on that. We will be very interested in hearing from them what the main takeaways are, and also how they see the steps going forward. And then, as I said, I'll ask Dr. Kamali to come in when he joins the event. So with that, over to you, Marc-André and Liz.
So thank you, Liz. I leave you.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And we're really looking forward to the discussion on the report that was presented by GISD in the fall. We listed 8 recommendations where we felt that If we could act on these recommendations, there would be a stronger partnership between the private sector and the MDBs. And I will go through those 8 and then hand over to Marc-Andre to talk about some of the outreach and alliance work that we're doing. And would also like to highlight the positive examples as we go through those recommendations. So we do know that the private sector is increasingly engaged in helping to finance the SDGs. That I speak for Bank of America. We have an important sustainable finance commitment that we've made, 1.5 trillion by 2030 in support of the SDGs. And we really are looking for ways to move into markets that are much more familiar to the UN system and the MDBs than they are to large global banks. And so we really are seeking partnerships as we move forward into emerging markets. The 8 recommendations, the first one is really to have incentives and a strategy at the MDBs to mobilize so that there is essentially targets that can be set to bring in private capital. IFC does have those targets, but not very many of the MDBs and DFIs have specific strategies and targets. So that was the first recommendation. The second is that the shareholders of the MDBs could work together to help to bring that prioritization of mobilization, which is to be open to those kinds of scorecard targets, to be open to products that bring in the private sector, and also to look at the kinds of projects that can be done together. The third recommendation is to focus on blended finance. The blended finance can be very useful because it does provide layering and risk appetite for different types of investors. What we've seen today has more been small and a bit more bespoke in some of the most difficult markets, which is definitely a requirement, but also to see if we might be able to think about structures that could blend finance at scale. The fourth recommendation is using those catalytic concessional funds that are available to the MDBs as judiciously as possible in really the markets that are the riskiest, where there are greatest gaps between the risk profiles that institutional investors can take and that exist in those markets. And the donor community is quite generous with project preparation, dollars or euros or denominated in whichever currency, that these, which are really being put to use to develop markets and open markets, can be done perhaps with some consultation with the private investors to see in advance where those open markets will gain the most receptivity. The fifth recommendation is for standardization. There's been a long-standing recommendation to standardize documents or approaches. It's a very complex environment for private financial institutions to navigate, and what we see when the MDBs get together to standardize approaches, such as was done with mobilization and concessional finance, it does help the private sector to engage when there is a more standardized approach. The sixth recommendation is to look at specific investment themes that are of interest to the private sector. And this almost seems dated now to mention things like energy transition and inclusion. In November, we didn't actually have as urgent a focus as we do today on energy transition, but I think that is a theme that we've already seen emerge as one where the development banks and the private sector can definitely partner together. The seventh recommendation is to increase the investor access to the blended and development finance investments and assets today, and to be able to have more visibility into future pipelines. There is a lot of work, as we know, even at the UN around building pipelines and being able to make some of those projects more visible, more bankable. And we welcome all of these initiatives and want to be able to support the growth of pipeline development. And the last is to make data available so that the track records of the investments can be better known and actually better shared with private investor risk committees, because there are de-risking factors that the MDBs bring, which are not well understood, or not as well understood as they could be at private investment firms. And so these were the list of the recommendations that we had put forward, and we have some engagement strategies that we are currently working on, and I will hand over to Marc-André to go through those alliances and engagement strategies. Thank you.
So thank you, Liz, and thank you, Amar, for moderating, and their co-panelists and the people at the UN. Nice to be back. It's unfortunate that we're not in person, but I'm so excited to be in touch with the community. So as Liz said, so on the GIS, the 8 recommendation, how to do that, and how are we pushing for making sure that we influence and we have the dialogue. First of all, I want to thank the World Bank and the IFC in particular for engaging with the dialogue with us and others, development bank like the Inter-American Development Bank and the African Development Bank and Asian Development Bank. We have been in touch, and we are working closely to actually ensure the dialogue is ongoing, and that actually initiatives are developed together. When I was at the UN, that's not so long ago, as representative of Canada 2 years ago, it was difficult to exactly know what the private sector was wanted. A lot of people were saying, well, what the private sector, what is needed for the private sector to come in? Well, the private sector in the last year, and I was happy now to be on the other side and to be contributed to that. But in 3 instances, whether it's GISD or it's through the SMI, the Sustainable Market Initiatives of Prince Charles and Brian Moynihan from the Bank of America, or actually with GFANS, and also we could add a 4th one with ILN, the Investors Leadership Network. So we've said what was needed, that actually, and they reflect basically the 8 recommendations that Liz went through. And we're trying to all work together. So, SMI, GFANS, ILN, GISD, we're trying to actually all work together to make sure that the aim is the same. The aim is what? For the private sector, the issue is get the right risk return equation nexus right. And this is, you could do that in many instances. The MDBs were created at the time, the Bretton Woods institutions were created at the time when there was basically very little institutional investors in the world, less than 250 billions in the 50s. Now it's more than, some say it's between 150 and 250 trillions of institutional investors, almost 1,000 times more than before. And yet the Bretton Woods institutions, we all need to adapt to each other, and we need to make sure that we can work more closely together and develop partnerships that maybe a few years ago were unthinkable. And I actually am very optimistic, since I'm on the private sector side and the institutional investor side, that this is possible. There's a willingness for institutional investors to contribute, to make sure that we fight climate change and that we fight inequalities. But you need to understand that private institutional investors, we come in at a market rates. We come in as a private investor, and we are not looking for no risk. We're looking for the right equation between risk and return. So this is why it's so important to work together to actually make sure that we work and develop. One of the biggest impediment to private sector investment is the FX risk. So, and there are a variety of guarantees and insurance that currently exist, but they are rigid often, and they lack the flexibility necessary for us to invest. So, and there's a variety of risk that are not catered for, and or are only catered for partially. So, you need a significant increase of guarantees that need to be dealing specifically with the FX risk. You could do that. Let's take an example. A large fund which could be operated by the MDBs in connection with the G20 and the G7 and representatives of the institutional investors. And the resources for this fund could be drawn from the current IFI resources and supplemented by using a portion of the large SDR allocations that are actually being talked about and being given. And such a fund with additional resources would also help the MDBs to maintain their current highest investment grade rating. Although, as the U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor noted, is it necessary that the AAA rating is so sacrosanct? And Secretary Yellen said the same thing. So that's the on the FX risk. There needs to be also a real push for a pipeline of investable, bankable projects. That is important. This is important because there's a lot of money that exists. There's a lot of projects that exist. The bridge between the two is not always as obvious. And at the UN, in the MDBs, what I can say is that we often talk about it from a country perspective. We talk about it from an MDB perspective, but you also have to look at the problem from the investor's perspective. And what are the investors looking for? And it's back to this nexus between risk and return. So that's what we need to be focusing on. And making sure that we have bankable projects is a way to de-risk some of the projects for the institutional investors. So I'm very hopeful, Amar, that we have this dialogue going on with the GISD. I think we have to applaud the GISD to have been able to come out with these 8 recommendations, and now we need to make them real for all countries. And we know that how difficult it is to actually make sure that in some of our smaller, lower income countries, small island states, lower income countries, lower middle income countries as well, that it's difficult for some to actually attract the right investments. But if we all work hard and think differently, work out of the box here, and think differently about how we can help each other getting there. I can tell you, as an institutional investors, we are interested to have that discussion. We're interested to go into these countries. We're interested to work, but together. But we need to. There's a lot of us that, and I'll talk for my institution. There's a lot of learning we need to do. There's a lot of trust that needs to be built. There's a lot of new partnership that needs to be built, and we must start by actually doing some small steps that will allow us to do the bigger steps that are needed. And we have no time on top of that to do it. It's urgent that we all do that.
Thank you, Marc-Andre. I see now that His Excellency Ahmed Kamali, Deputy Minister of Planning Economic Development of Egypt, is on. Deputy Minister, if you could maybe just give us your reflections in a few minutes, then we will open up the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me in this very important event, which is associated with two things which are extremely important, not only for Egypt. I think it's true for all developing countries and as well as developed countries, about the MDGs and the private sector and private finance. Let me kind of give you four kind of telegraphic points that I wanted to share with you today. The first point is like a traditional thing that we all talk about. It's about the financial gap. Before the COVID, before the pandemic, it's the financial gap was a matter of allocation of resources. So there was a challenge in terms of having the efficient allocation of resources in order to achieve the SDGs. However, now with the COVID, there is some additional challenge in terms of the availability of the fund because of the reduction in the fiscal space in most countries, especially in developing countries, and because of the stimulus packages and the reduction in government revenue. Now there is a very important need for finance, and we believe that the MDBs can definitely play a very important function in this. But the most important thing is concentrating on impact investment. So this is my first point, and this kind of the traditional thing that is associated with MDBs. One of another point, which is a bit less traditional, is the education of the private sector. It is true that most of the MDB's portfolio is dedicated to the private sector, and it's true in Egypt. However, it is very important to push the private sector to have an integration of the dimension of sustainability, of the three dimensions of sustainability, to invite companies and firms to measure the carbon footprint, to linking project with the different SDGs, to promote responsible production and consumption, to have an assessment of the environmental impact. This is extremely important. If the MDB is pushed to private sector through to have these kind of things, I think this is will achieve both that we are kind of promoting investment and at the same time achieving the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. The third point, and this is a very important point, especially in large large countries like Egypt. There should be focus on the geographical balance of project, and there should be give some kind of incentives to finance private establishment in remote and underdeveloped areas. And I think this should be part of like the KPIs of there are lots of KPIs for a given MDB, but if this is part of the KPIs of the MDB in order to have more equality in terms of finance, if I may say, I think this will have so much positive effect on the welfare of the country and the achievement of the SDGs and to have more equality. Let me give you just an example from Egypt. And this is something that we have seen. We have the economic census that is a census on the different establishment. It's done each 5 years. And what we saw is that in the recent census, that there is more concentration of establishment, of firms in urban areas, in the main cities. And this is something that we don't want to do, we don't want to have. And I think the MDBs can play a very important function in this in order to have a more diversified allocation of finance and companies in different. This has a positive, definitely impact on poverty and equality and balance, geographical balance. Last thing, soft skills. I think this is again something that we saw it from the census. there are a number of firms that have idle capacity that they went bankrupt. And more than 60% of these companies, they have identified that they have problems in marketing their products. So it is very important to, and this is could be promoted and definitely could be promoted by the MDBs to promote soft skills for these for the private sector, and at the same time pushing for bridging the digital divide. Digital divide is it's something that exists between and within countries. So if we push for that, and if the MDBs push for this agenda with governments, I think this is going to be have a significant impact on reducing the cost of transaction and to gain more efficiency. Thank you very much for having me, and I'll be here definitely, and looking forward to listen to the intervention of this distinguished panel. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you very much for those very pertinent comments, and I'm sure they will come up as we proceed. I wanted to just pick up a little bit on the recommendations and the framing of it, and then move the discussion to this, to especially engaging, with the MDB side and getting the perspectives. The discussions have highlighted that there's a bridge that we have to cross. On the one hand, we need, bankable, viable, projects that can be brought forward in order for the private sector to invest in them. So Marc-Andre mentioned that we need strong effort on scaling up the pipeline of bankable projects, and MDBs obviously have a critical role to play there. And the second is that, given the nature of the investments, and also some of the countries in which the investments have to happen, risk reduction, risk sharing, risk management is crucial. And that's a partnership between the private sector and the public sector. And MDBs, again, have a crucial role to play in terms of all of those three functions. And in this, it's also an issue, as the recommendations point out, about incentives and about the commitment of shareholders as well to this agenda. So I want to open the panel by asking Denise Odaro. We were going to split this in two sessions, one on constraints, one on solutions. I also know, Denise, you have a constraint. So I would suggest we just take it as a package. IFC has been really leading very much on this focus on upstream. You've done a lot in recent years to move much more towards the upstream. And as Marc-Andre said, you've also been a pioneer and indeed strongly committed to the mobilization agenda. I know from other interactions on the initiatives that are underway. So it will be very good to hear from you as a leader of the MDBs in this area, of what you think is going well, what you think can be done better, and what are the initiatives that are in the report that you really feel are worth now pushing hard on.
Thank you very much, Amar. I am very honoured to be a part of this rather distinguished panel. And let me start off by commending the GSID on this position paper, which very eloquently puts a great position as to where we are and where things need to go. So to answer your question more specifically, I will say that when you consider the landscape as it is, and in my role as head of investor relations, I am frontline speaking to investors about their appetite and desire to partake in projects and to pursue SDG financing. And two of the most common gaps that I would say that I continually hear is one, this essentially the dearth, the scarcity of investors willing to take on the riskiest projects. And of course, in tandem, there's very limited early stage finance in developing countries. Now, both of these gaps are particularly acute, as you can imagine, in essentially smaller and even fragile countries. where transaction costs are high relative to obviously the potential size of investments. I think Marc-Andre had put this very nicely, and Liz had highlighted some of this, and His Excellency did the same. The fact is that we as MDBs, we possess a unique position, a capital structure that allows us to operate in high-risk environments, AAA ratings. And on the basis of this, and of course our idiosyncratic relationship with country governments, we're able to, of course, do things that others can't. And in the position paper, in fact, raised two core amendments that I thought made absolute sense, two core recommendations, forgive me. And that's essentially looking at what does our model look like right now, and how do we take it to this place where we really are scaling up private sector participation. Now, in your words, and I concur with it, what we need to do is, one, how do we change our model, incentivizing essentially the entire infrastructure that we have to transfer exposure to private investors? This is something that I think deserves more of a harder look. We are judged, of course, on volumes in many instances. And here we are, we're trying to mobilize. And I think that there is, of course, this elephant in the room where it's a sort of, how do you manage that balance? So that's the first thing, is how do we move that incentive to essentially passing on exposure. Second is, again, you talked very much about this, bringing in, how do we, of course, the second tier capital in blended finance structures, how do we change our model to essentially originate and arrange those loans, but then transfer it, but also bringing in, concessionary financing and taking things to the next level. And this, of course, will free up resources, as we say. So we need to work better at this. I would say that, so increasing, and we all talk about scale, we're halfway through to the SDGs, the halfway point, and looking back and looking forward, just noting that scale is incredibly important, and efficiency when we're talking about private markets. But of course, when you look at the MDB model, efficiency, we're not necessarily known for our efficiency, albeit that we're known for very many good things. And I do think that this is where that recommendation around a programmatic approach would aid things. How do we streamline approval processes for projects to essentially take this to the level that is similar in the private sector? And this would allow, of course, this facilitation to a wider and broader access of concessionary resources in the same timeline that we're used to. I mean, I say this, my background coming from most of the investment banks of the world, some of them which are no longer with us, rest in peace, to the World Bank. And that disparity, of course, in terms of how we look at things, which I do not say that with any negative connotations, because we are thorough, of course, given the standards that we have. However, there is that disparity, and I think that needs to be brought together and balanced. Let me stop there and see if there are any questions before I go on to the next part of the question that you'd asked.
No, Denise, why don't you go ahead, and then I'll shift to the other panelists. I know that you have to go, so I just want to make sure that you have the time right now. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Amar. So I wanted to touch on the blended finance solutions, and you very rightly mentioned that IFC has been leading in this. And just looking at, say, this landscape last year, we saw around the DFIs, there was already an increase of about 14% of concessional funding coming into DFIs for this purpose. And the volume of projects also increased by around 5%. When you look also at geographically, where is it that we are using most of the funds? I mean, perhaps rightly so, when you look at the needs, the uses are mostly in lower middle income countries, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. We have done so much around creating new products and deploying concessional donor funds towards these needs. Last year, we did 1.6 billion of concessional donor funding to support 266 projects in over 50 countries. So I think there is a lot of progress, and of course at IFC we're structuring this as debt, equity, risk sharing that we talked about earlier, guaranteed projects, etc. And the solutions that we look at depend, amongst other things, on the market barriers and failures that need to be addressed, depending on the requirements of the donors. The other thing I wanted to highlight in terms of the innovations that have taken place is the DFI enhanced principles for blended finance. And IFC is the chair of this working group on the blended concessional finance, which consists of around 20 DFIs. And this, started off in 2017, and this set of guidelines now aim to maximize this impact and essentially standardize the use of concessional resources, which I think is pretty apt given the scenario that we're looking at now. The last thing I want to mention is that there is this momentum, and we ought to certainly ride this wave. When you look at the several institutions already expect a significant increase in the use of their blended concessional finance over the next few years. And a lot of this is driven by the Building Back Better programs and the need to, of course, address climate change with greater focus on emerging markets, globally, in fact. I would say that these areas we need to continue to tap into this, and focusing on the areas that need the most assistance: renewables, green cities, helping farmers, MSMEs, etc. And that's where I hope that conversations like this can certainly aid to that.
Thank you very much, Denise, for that. If you do need to drop off, we fully understand. I'm going to now turn to Jorge Velarde. So Jorge Velarde, as I mentioned, is from CAF. What I call the homegrown MDB of Latin America, and it's been extremely innovative actually on the private finance mobilization. I would really appreciate hearing from you, Jorge. What are, as you see, some of the challenges that you face, especially in the kind of diverse client set that you work with? And second, everybody talks about scale. As actually the scale of MDB support has declined over time for the MDGs, and now what are the SDGs. So how do you also see responding to this challenge of going to scale?
Thank you, Amar. Let me begin by acknowledging the contribution of the GISD Alliance in delivering concrete recommendations, which I am sure will be effective in scaling up private investment mobilization. To some extent, as you say, this is a CAF's home-owned MDB. Yes, due to our capital structure, where over 90% of the share capital belongs to developing countries, CAF is indeed a good example of mobilization per se. However, there is room to do much more in terms of mobilizing private capital. CAF shareholders recently approved the largest capital increase in our history, sending a clear mandate to foster partnership with the private sector and to promote private capital mobilization. We of course see a few challenges. First of all, the limitations in the ability to build robust pipelines of bankable projects, limitation in capital utilization, and limitation of access to donor or concessional funds to increase financial additionality. Pipeline building difficulties are explained by MDBs as in part by their own limitations in terms of origination capacity or ticket sizes, but also due to the absence of adequate regulatory frameworks for political stability and limited predictability in developing economies, especially in the least developed markets. Capital utilization, which is a key challenge since we all would prefer to increase the deployment of our own resources. But MDBs need to maintain credit ratings to ensure access to competitive funds, specifically organizations such as CAF. Indeed, high liquidity margins compensate exposure to riskier markets or currencies. Finally, for the same reasons, the limitations to intermediate tier-free resources condition our ability to structure assets that will generate a greater financial additionality. However, we do believe that partnering with local development actors or regional development actors will promote in a great degree the flexibility for creating frameworks and vehicles that will promote mobilization. In terms of how to scale up and solutions for scaling up mobilization, we do believe there is room for innovation in new blended finance products and structures. In the first place, we believe that CAF may develop a strategy to approach and collaborate more effectively with private investors to increase transparency and provide quality information in the impact or climate of objectives of each of the project financings that we structure. Try to align interests, try to promote opportunities and facilitate access to the investors to these opportunities, identify for them the risks, and ensure they will obtain market returns, as previous panelists mentioned. And definitely try to assume a ranger or managerial agency roles in the transactions that we structure. On the other hand, MDBs could try to introduce tools to allow planning and projection of mobilization potential of projects as part of the prioritization and investment decision-making process. And finally, MDBs, such as CAF, should focus on evolving from the traditional mobilization scheme focused on single operations and scale up and adopt broader mobilization mechanisms, for example, by portfolio, vehicles, aggregation funds, or through the use of mobilization platforms. CAF, through its asset manager, CAFAM, for instance, another similar initiative is involved in this challenge currently. I will stop here and continue with the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jorge. So let me now turn to Marcus Svedberg. You bring the perspective of a national pension fund, of course, based in the north, and interested in investing in the SDGs, which really are, of course, primarily investment opportunities in the south. How do you see, in some sense, the routes and the impediments in those routes, and also how do you see the solutions that are put forward in the GISD paper?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for having me. And full disclaimer, I used to work in the board of IFC, so I'll use IFC as an example for what I have to say. We've heard a lot of mentioning of scale and mobilization and so on and so forth, and I think that is the right way to target this. The scale of the challenge here is enormous. In the memo that was sent out before this, it was the financing up, and the deputy minister mentioned it. It's somewhere between $3 to $5 trillion a year. It's enormous. And so when we talk about increasing, it's not about increasing this financing by 10 or 20 or 30%. It's about an order of magnitude that's 3, 4, 5, 10 times. Let me use IFC as an example. And I only use it because I know it and I think they're doing some great things, and we're investing in some of the products they've put out. IFC last year had commitments of 20 billion. When I was there a couple of years ago, there was a managing director who launched a slogan which was from billions to trillions. I really like that because that set the ambition very, very high. If IFC is going to move from billions to trillions, they need to grow by 50 times. Going to the national governments, to the owners, and asking for 50 times more money, I don't think that's going to fly. They may get more, and I think they should get more, but they also need to use whatever money they have to mobilize it, even leverage it even more. And that's where institutional investors come in. So, MDBs put, concessional money, and then to de-risk, and then institutional investors can put a lot of money in. And we need to do this, several times more than we do today. And we can do it by expanding some of the things we're already doing. There are some very, very good, not only from IFC, but from other MDBs, some very good examples. We can do a lot more of those, but we can also innovate. We can do new things. And I think sometimes we're a bit, especially if you're not a finance professional, you'll be worried about the technicalities. These are difficult things. That's solvable. And that's what finance is very good at. we can solve these things, but we also need a commitment on all levels. How can we really do this? You know, the order of magnitude that's necessary. It's still going to be good if we increase it by 10%, but if we can increase it by an order of magnitude of 10, that's obviously, then we will start to talking about getting close to closing this financing gap, but only then. And leverage, another word for leverage is risk. So we also need to have very serious conversations in the institutions that are buying this about risk. What kind of risk are we? But we also need to have serious conversations in the boards of the development banks and the MDBs about what kind of risk are we willing to increase the risk? And then we're coming down to things like ratings and so on. We need to have this conversation with rating agencies. Do we really understand what kind of risk this means? So I think we're onto something. We're doing a lot of good things. I'm very happy to see that the number of transactions that have been coming out to the market in the last 2-3 years have really increased. And if we had the benefit of infinity, that would be great, but we don't. So we really need to accelerate this. And again, we know what to do, but we also need to have these tough conversations about risk and scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. So I do believe that we are at a important inflection point right now, and it came through, as Marc-Andre was saying, very strongly during the IMF World Bank spring meetings, and it has been building, in the couple years leading up to COP26. As Marc-Andre said, we now have almost a consortium of private sector coalitions, GISD, of course, GFANZ now. GFANZ has made a commitment to try and mobilize $1 trillion a year for green investments, SMI, ILN, as you mentioned, Marc-Andre, but also CFLI, Fast Infra, all working towards a purpose of increased sort of investment support related to the SDGs. And this, I think, is a real powerful change in both the view, the commitment of the private sector to the SDGs, but to translate it, as this report suggests, into a concrete program of action. On the other side, I think at the spring meetings we saw a strong resonance for the words that you were talking about, Marcus: scale, urgency, and quality. Those are the three words I used to describe the challenge. And that, I think, again, seems to have resonates now very strongly. And we've heard many times the call for a new Bretton Woods, transformative, radical change. It doesn't often come from the Secretary of the U.S. Treasury and the National Economic Security Advisor of the White House. I think so. The change, in some sense, on the pressure of the MDB system right now to really scale up, I think, is quite powerful. So in that context, I want to come back to you, Marc-Andre and Liz, and pose to you two questions that are implicit in the work that you have done. One is, as you said, it's all about risk, and therefore the understanding and the abatement of the risks. And on the other side, it's all about the cost of capital. Because if the cost of capital is too high, then private finance is not a solution, it's a problem. So it's actually tackling this that is the holy grail. And you mentioned this, Marc-Andre, but I want to push it further. A key risk from a macroeconomic point of view is exchange rate risk. A key risk from the sector point of view is regulatory risk. In the case of energy transition, for example, offtake, regulatory risk, utility risk, these are major risks that private investors have to take. And what we need are solutions at scale, but in the specific country circumstances that we face. One solution that is being pushed quite hard right now is country platforms. G7 is pushing this quite hard. We have the South Africa Just Energy Transition platform that has come forward. And what is new is essentially a recognition that these country platforms have to have a dominant role for the private sector. Okay. So question to you and Liz is, if we really want to move towards that scale approach, what do we need to do so that, the risk is mitigated, but that the cost of capital is reasonable? And second, how can we move on the implementation front? And are these country platforms that are being now pushed a possible way for the private sector to engage at scale? So over to you, Marc-Andre and Liz, and I will look if there are any other questions in the chat.
Liz, you want to go ahead?
Sure, thank you. And it's been so interesting to hear all of the comments that have been made. And I think that we are really converging around the topic of risk and scale. So first of all, it makes sense for the MDBs and the DFIs to focus on the smallest and most riskiest environments. Those are places that maybe the cost of getting there for the private sector would be too high. But there are a lot of very large problems out there and challenges that can be addressed at scale. And I think that there are some very good models. Jorge mentioned also the role to play of aggregating projects and platforms. And we do see products that the MDBs offer that do target those specific risks. Whether it's the regulatory risk or the currency convertibility risk. So there are these potential solutions. However, they're very fragmented at the moment. And so I think one of the benefits of these kinds of conversations and the coalitions that are developing both on the private sector side and on the development finance side are that the resources can come together in order to really specifically address some of the risks that are seen and to defray those risks at a cost that then can really mobilize capital. So I think we're seeing this at an individual project level, but I think where we need to move to is to be able to look at this at a more platform aggregator level. And even Bank of America is looking at some kinds of platforms with certain sponsors that can aggregate small countries, like small island states, together with larger country projects so that it can be financed at scale. So I'll stop there and hand back to Marc-Andre.
I think that's a good segue, Liz. I think country platforms are a good thing, but we also need to complement this country-specific approach with the cross-country platforms. I find that the country platforms are good with the specific goal, for example, of taking a country off coal. I think that makes a lot of sense. But it's a bit like we need to work on all legs of the stool at the same time. I think we need to work on country platforms, but we also need to work on cross-country platforms, and we need to work on making sure that rapidly, very user-friendly, let's keep it simple, very user-friendly de-risking instruments are available at scale for institutional investors. And I thought that Marcus put it very, very well in terms of, like, we're talking of moving from billions to trillions here. We're talking about doing things massively differently than what we've been doing. And I'm just saying, there's no magic bullet. I understand that. That's why we need to work on the country platforms. But also, we need to, and that's the thing where the friction a bit between, let's be honest, between institutional investors and the MDBs, were the MDBs, the institutional investors did not exist really in a big way when the MDBs were created. Now, if you look at it, the institutional investors in the world, depending on the numbers you take, but these numbers sometimes are very big, but we're 900 times bigger than the MDBs. So you just need but yet very few of the instruments offered by the MDBs are targeting really at de-risking investments for the institutional investors. And this is where we need to get at. Maybe it's not the role of the MDBs. Maybe it's something else, because the MDBs have their AAA objectives, and some criticize them and some are questioning it. But this is why, like, we need to find rapidly, if you want institutional investors to behave differently, you need to give the incentives right. We're telling the world, wait a second, we're willing to go, but the risk return equation is not there. And we won't be able to go as much as we would like unless you help us with de-risking first loss, FX risk, and help us with the pipeline of projects. And we're saying to the MDBs, please share more information, even more with us. You have this great information. The reason why we're turning to the MDBs is the MDBs have way better knowledge of the grounds than we do at most institutional investors like me, like mine. But we need a different kind of partnership and way of looking at it. And I know some people at some MDBs are saying, Marc-André, I'm not in the business of de-risking CDPQ. Well, I'm saying fine, but then I won't be able to go do as much things as I want in differently or in new markets, because we just cannot get there with our risk return equation. And so I'm telling you, the one of the keys to go from billions to trillions is it had to be with institutional investors. There's no way around this. But for that, we need to think differently. So far, everybody, countries and the MDBs think that they are the preeminent, they have the preeminent role in finance for lower middle income countries or low income countries. I'm saying, I think there are some places that the private sector will never go, let's be honest. But there are a lot of sectors where the private sector can go with the right incentives and the right guarantees. And that will allow us to learn and to start the wheel turning. But that needs to be, there needs to be a mind shift that needs to be changed in some of the MDBs and also with some of the governments. And but I'm hopeful because things are being developed. You've heard Liz is developing platforms to go in small island states at Bank of America. This is fantastic. At CDPQ, and I know that in Scandinavia and Sweden, you're doing at AP4 doing great things. But I can tell you, I'll finish on that. At CDPQ, we're developing a platform now to go in adaptation infrastructure in 25 low-income countries. You know, some people in the MDBs may look at this and say, oh, it's only 1.2 billion and it's only 100 million per country. But I'm telling them, listen, this is something we were not doing a year ago. This is something new. This is something innovative. We're working with some multilateral agencies, with some other financial institutions, and we're working with some family offices with the philanthropic sector that is needed for actually developing bankable projects. You see, this is completely uncharted territories, things we were not doing a year ago that we need to do to go from billions to trillions. And that just shows you that the mindset is changing and that this is why I'm so hopeful. But we all need to be pushing together on this and accepting that we look at it differently. Like, get around what Marcus said. Some people may say, oh, like, I cannot get my head around this. And well, we have to try to think about it differently. And I think all of us, if we want, it's urgent that we all align better capital with sustainable development, and that's we all in this together. And I'm hopeful for that, and that's why this work by GISD is so important.
Thank you, Marc-André. Thank you, Liz. So let me close on a optimistic mood. You know, we are in a Dickens-like times. We are in the worst of times, as the world situation shows, but we're also in the best of times in the sense of the possibilities now of collaboration to really ramp up particularly between the private and the public sector. The work that the GIST task force has done, I really think can make a big difference. Let me leave 4 propositions from this discussion that might serve, I think, as a way forward. First, the need ultimately to be able to act at country or regional or sub-regional level to make a difference. Because if we have a purposeful, goal-oriented approach at the country level, that's a powerful means for producing scalable action. Second, as Liz said, we need platforms to support that, as both of you said. And that's platforms for both standardization and aggregation, but also for information, data, and the like. So I think we should push for that kind of platforms. Clearly, replicable, scalable approaches to risk reduction, risk sharing, and risk pooling will be extremely important. And I think there's a lot of potential there for actually building a much more structured approach, as you were saying, Marc-Andre. I entirely agree that the mechanisms right now for exchange rate risk, which are absolutely critical in this space, are not there. I also agree that we need mechanisms to deal with the specific sector and, indeed, counterparty risks in countries. So that's also an area of great potential. I think there are many fundamental changes that will have to be made, but we are at a moment where, with the coalitions coming forward and with the MDBs and their shareholders recognizing that there's something fundamental has to happen, I hope in this coming year we will build on the report that you have, but leading it to very, very concrete proposals of action, both by the MDBs as well as by the private sector. So with that note, let me close. I just want to see if Minister Kamali has any closing words, to round out the session.
Thank you very much. I think I enjoyed very much the conversation. I think it's very, very important to continue have this conversation. And in terms of all of this, of these risks, it is extremely important not to take the risk as the same across region and across countries. In our study of models of contagion, for example, when you start treating countries as they are the same, then you're going to get into lots of problems associated with pulling investment out of the countries and causing some financial and currency crises. And sometimes even the fundamentals in a given country is quite good. So it is it is very important to a little bit invest in data and information, and to have some intelligence when it comes to data and information specific for countries, and not treating countries as a coherent, homogeneous pool of a kind of the same sample. Thank you very much for having me. It was a great. It's a great event, and I really enjoyed the different comments and views expressed by all the distinguished panelists. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Minister. If I would urge everybody who has not looked at it, there were some very, very insightful comments in the chat. So, those of you who haven't, you may want to look at those. I also wanted to tell all participants that there will be country discussions on El Salvador and Guatemala at 2 p.m. In today's SDG fair. So please tune in at 2 p.m. Nothing left for me to do but thank the panelists, thank Liz Bronder and Marc-Andre Brochard, both for being here today. and for leading the report that, I think, really has helped take the agenda forward in a very timely way, because, having the report now gives us a very concrete base for discussion. I thank the other panelists. Denise Raro had to leave. Then also Marcus Svedberg from the fourth Swedish National Pension Fund, and last but not least, Jorge Velarde from CAF. So I thank the UNDESA for organizing this. Thank all the participants, and hope you have gotten as much as I have out of this great discussion. So thank everybody, and you're all welcome to join again at 2 p.m.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.